The morning started like any other. People woke up, drank their coffee, and went to work. Children played in parks. Lovers held hands on busy streets. The year was 2147, and humanity had never been more hopeful about the future. Lyra Vasquez stood in her kitchen in Buenos Aires, watching her daughter Sofia eat breakfast. The girl was 7 years old, with dark curly hair and a smile that could light up any room. Her husband Marco sat across the table, reading news on his tablet. "Mama, can we go to the beach this weekend?" Sofia asked. Lyra smiled and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Of course, my love. I just need to finish some work at the base first." She was a general in the United Earth Defense Force, one of the highest-ranking military officers on the planet. But today was supposed to be a quiet day. No threats. No emergencies. Just paperwork and meetings. She never made it to that beach. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the sky changed color. It went from bright blue to deep orange in seconds. People stopped walking on the streets and looked up. Some took pictures with their phones. Nobody understood what was happening. Then the fire came. Massive beams of light descended from the clouds. They struck the ground with the force of 1,000 nuclear bombs. Buildings that had stood for centuries disappeared in the blink of an eye. Millions of people turned to ash before they could even scream. Buenos Aires was one of the first cities to burn. New York followed 3 minutes later. Then Beijing. Then London. Then Moscow. Then Sydney. City after city, country after country, the fire fell from the sky without warning and without mercy. Lyra was in a military vehicle racing toward her base when the beam hit Buenos Aires. The blast threw her car off the road. She woke up in a ditch, her ears ringing, her body covered in cuts and bruises. When she looked back at the city, there was nothing left, just a crater of melted glass and black smoke. Her home, her husband, her daughter, gone. She screamed. She screamed until her throat bled. Then she stood up, wiped the blood from her face, and started walking toward the base. The attack lasted for 12 hours. 2 billion people died on the first day. 2 billion. The number was too large for the human mind to truly understand. It was not a war. It was an extermination. The attackers finally showed themselves on the second day. They called themselves the Velthari Empire. They had conquered over 2,000 worlds across the galaxy. They were tall, thin creatures with gray skin and 4 black eyes. They had lived for thousands of years. They had technology that made humanity look like children playing with toys. To them, Earth was just another resource to harvest. Humans were just another primitive species to remove. They did not hate humanity. They did not fear humanity. They simply did not care about humanity at all. They wiped out cities the same way a farmer might clear weeds from a field. The Velthari expected humanity to surrender within a week. They expected the survivors to beg for mercy, to accept their fate, to quietly die in the ruins of their civilization. They were wrong. Across the planet, survivors refused to give up. They retreated into bunkers that governments had secretly built over decades. They hid in mountain caves and underground tunnels. They gathered in the ruins of cities, armed with whatever weapons they could find. They were broken, burned, and bleeding. But they were not beaten. Lyra reached the military base 3 days after the attack. Half the buildings were destroyed, but the underground command center was still operational. Officers and soldiers gathered around her, their faces covered in dust and despair. They looked at her with empty eyes, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. She stood before them, a woman who had lost everything she loved. Her uniform was torn. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "I know what you are feeling," she said. "I feel it too. The pain, the grief, the anger. They took everything from us. Our homes, our families, our future." She paused and looked at each face in the room. But they made a mistake. They thought fire would break us. They thought we would give up and die. They do not understand what humans are. They do not understand that we have faced extinction before. Ice ages, plagues, wars, Every time, we survived. Every time, we came back stronger. Her voice grew harder, colder. The Velthari see us as insects, as nothing. They did not even give us the respect of a warning. They did not negotiate. They did not ask questions. They simply decided to erase us from existence. She slammed her fist on the table. Remember that. Remember what they took. Remember the names of everyone you lost. Write them down. Carry them with you. Because one day, we will make them remember too. 9, 9, 9, 9, 9. A young soldier raised his hand. General, how can we fight them? Their technology is centuries ahead of ours. Their ships are like nothing we have ever seen. Lyra nodded slowly. I do not have all the answers yet. But I know this. We will learn. We will adapt. We will steal their technology and make it our own. And we will never, ever stop fighting until they pay for what they did. She walked to the window and looked out at the burning horizon. Smoke covered the sky like a funeral shroud. Somewhere beneath that smoke were the ashes of her daughter, her husband, her entire world. They came here to kill us, she said quietly. They will leave here as ghosts and memories. I swear it on the graves of everyone we lost. The officers in the room stood straighter. The despair in their eyes began to change into something else. Something harder. Something dangerous. Humanity had been knocked down. Humanity had been burned, broken, and nearly destroyed. But humanity was not dead, and humanity would never forget. In orbit above the dying planet, the Velthari commanders watched the last fires burn out. They marked Earth as pacified in their records and began planning the mining operations. Another successful cleansing. Another world added to the empire. They did not notice the small groups of survivors gathering underground. They did not see the scientists already studying pieces of crashed Velthari fighters. They did not hear the whispered promises of revenge passing from bunker to bunker across the globe. They had made the worst mistake any conqueror could make. They had left survivors. And those survivors remembered everything. 5 years passed beneath the burned surface of Earth. The Velthari had grown bored with hunting survivors. To them, humanity was already dead. They set up mining stations in orbit and sent machines to dig up precious metals from the ground. A small occupation force remained to manage operations, but the aliens rarely looked down at the planet anymore. Why would they? There was nothing left worth watching. They were wrong. Deep underground, humanity was alive. Not just surviving, but growing, changing, becoming something new. General Lyra Vasquez had united the scattered survivors into a single force. There were no more countries now, no more flags or borders or old rivalries. Russian soldiers trained beside American engineers. Chinese scientists worked with European doctors. African farmers shared food with Japanese technicians. The old world had burned. In its place, a new humanity was being forged. They called themselves the United Earth Resistance. Lyra walked through the tunnels of Underground City 7, one of the largest human settlements. It had been built in the bones of an old military bunker in what used to be Switzerland. Now it was home to over 50,000 people. Lights hung from stone ceilings. Gardens grew under artificial sun lamps. Children ran through narrow corridors, laughing and playing. Life continued, even in the darkness. But Lyra did not see the laughter. She saw only the work that needed to be done. She entered a large laboratory carved into the rock. Scientists in white coats worked at tables covered with strange metal parts. These were pieces of Velthari technology, collected from crashed ships and destroyed equipment. Every piece was studied, tested, taken apart, and put back together. Dr. Yuki Tanaka stood at the center of the room. She was a small woman with tired eyes and messy hair. She had not slept in 3 days. In her hands, she held a device no larger than a shoebox. "General," she said, her voice shaking with excitement. Lyra walked closer. "Did what?" Yuki placed the device on the table. "This is a Velthari faster-than-light drive. the engine that lets their ships travel between stars in minutes instead of years. We have spent 5 years trying to understand how it works. She pressed a button on the device. It hummed softly and glowed with blue light. We understand it now. We can build our own. Lyra stared at the small machine. 5 years ago, humanity had never left the solar system. They had sent probes to nearby planets, dreamed about distant stars, wondered if they were alone in the universe. Now they knew the answer. They were not alone, and the universe was cruel. But this device changed everything. How long until we can put this in a ship? Lyra asked. 6 months for a prototype, maybe a year for full production. Lyra nodded slowly. Do it. Use whatever resources you need. Take anyone you need. This is our top priority now. She turned and walked toward the door, then stopped. Yuki. This technology will let us reach the stars. But I do not want to run away. I want to reach the stars so we can bring the war to them. The Rizaspan life. The Retes. I want to the run. Yuki smiled grimly. I know, General. That is why I have been working without sleep. The next 2 years moved fast. Hidden factories were built in asteroid fields and beneath the frozen oceans of Europa. Ships took shape in the darkness of space, far from Velthari sensors. Each ship was named after a city that had been destroyed. The Times Buenos Aires asterisk. The Times New York asterisk. The Times Beijing asterisk. The Times London asterisk. Names of the dead, ready to bring death to those who killed them. Lyra pushed everyone hard. Too hard, some said. She trained soldiers until they collapsed. She demanded perfection from engineers. She never smiled, never rested, never stopped planning. Admiral Kofi Asante, her second in command, found her one night in the command center. She was staring at star maps, marking Velthari military bases and trade routes. You need to sleep, he said. I will sleep when they are defeated. Kofi sat down across from her. He was a big man with a gentle voice. He had lost his entire family in the attack on Lagos. He understood her pain better than most. Lyra, we cannot win this war if our leader destroys herself before the first battle. She did not look up from the maps. Every hour I rest is an hour they are not paying for what they did. And if you die from exhaustion, what happens to the resistance then? Lyra finally looked at him. Her eyes were red and tired. Lines had formed on her face that had not been there 5 years ago. She was 42 years old, but she looked 60. I see her face, Kofi, every time I close my eyes. Sophia. She was eating breakfast when the fire came. She did not even know what was happening. She was 7 years old. Kofi reached across the table and took her hand. I know. I see my children too. Every night. But we cannot let the dead drag us into the grave with them. We honor them by living, by winning, by making sure their deaths meant something. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hand. You are right. I know you are right. She took a deep breath. But I cannot rest yet. Not until I look into their eyes and make them understand what they did to us. Construction continued. The fleet grew larger. Soldiers trained harder. Spies infiltrated Velthari space using stolen ships and forged documents. They learned the enemy's weaknesses. They found cracks in the great empire. And they discovered something surprising. Humanity was not alone in their hatred of the Velthari. Messages came from other species. The Kreth, an insectoid race that had been enslaved for centuries. The Morvani, strange beings made of living crystal who had watched their homeworld stripped of resources. Others, many others, all of them crushed under the boot of the Velthari Empire. All of them watching humanity with something they had not felt in generations. Hope. 7 years after the attack on Earth, the human fleet was ready. 50 warships, 10,000 soldiers, millions of tons of weapons and supplies. Not enough to conquer an empire, but enough to hurt it. General Lyra Vasquez stood on the bridge of the flagship. The Times UES Remembrance asterisk. Through the viewport, she could see Earth, still scarred and wounded. But healing slowly, she turned to her communications officer. Open a channel to the Velthari High Command. All frequencies. I want every being in their empire to hear this. The officer nodded. Channel open, General. Lyra looked into the camera. Her face appeared on screens across 1,000 worlds. My name is General Lyra Vasquez of the United Earth Resistance. 7 years ago, you came to our world without warning. You burned our cities. You murdered our families. Her eyes burned with cold fire. You struck Earth first. Now we are coming for you. And we will not stop until your empire is nothing but ash and memory. She cut the transmission. The fleet jumped to faster than light speed. The war had begun. The Velthari colony of Nexar 7 floated peacefully in the void of space. It was a mining world, rich with rare metals and precious crystals. 50,000 Velthari lived there, along with 300,000 slaves from a dozen conquered species. Massive cargo ships came and went every day, carrying resources back to the Empire's core worlds. The Velthari governor sat in his office, reviewing production reports. Numbers and charts filled his screens. Everything was running smoothly. Everything was as it should be. Then the alarm started screaming. What is happening? He demanded. His aide's voice came through the communicator, shaking with fear. Governor, ships are dropping out of faster than light. Many ships. They are not ours. The governor rushed to his window and looked up at the sky. What he saw made his 4 black eyes go wide with terror. Human warships, dozens of them, blocking out the stars like a wall of metal and fury. Impossible, he whispered. They were supposed to be dead. The human fleet attacked without mercy. Their weapons tore through the orbital defense platforms in minutes. Dropships descended to the surface, carrying soldiers who had trained for 7 years for this moment. They did not target the slave quarters or the civilian housing. They targeted only the military bases and government buildings. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Velthari governor knelt in chains before General Lyra Vasquez. Around him, freed slaves were crying with joy, hugging the human soldiers who had liberated them. This is not possible, the governor said. Your species was pacified. You were nothing. How did you do this? Lyra looked down at him with cold eyes. You should have made sure we were truly dead. You should have hunted down every last human. But you did not. You thought we were insects. You did not even bother to finish what you started. She leaned closer. That was your mistake. The governor was sent to a prison ship to await trial for crimes against humanity. The slaves of Nexar 7 were given a choice. Stay and build a new life, or join the fight against the Empire. Many chose to fight. News of the attack spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The Velthari High Command could not believe it. A species they had marked as extinct had risen from the ashes and struck at the heart of their territory. It was unthinkable. It was terrifying. It was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, the human fleet became a legend. They struck without warning, disappeared into the void, then appeared somewhere else entirely. They freed slave worlds and destroyed military bases. They captured Velthari ships and turned them against their former masters. They recruited soldiers from every species the Empire had crushed. The Velthari called them the Ghost Fleet. They called Lyra Vasquez the Grey General. Because of the streak of white in her hair that had appeared after the burning of Earth, soldiers in the Empire began to fear assignment to outer colonies. Rumors spread that the humans could not be killed, that they felt no pain, that they came back from the dead to seek revenge. The rumors were false, of course. Humans could die. And many did. Admiral Kofi Asante stood beside Lyra on the bridge of the Times Remembrance Times after a particularly brutal battle. They had won, but the cost had been high. 3 ships destroyed, 800 soldiers killed, 800 more names to add to the memorial wall. We cannot keep taking losses like this, Kofi said quietly. We are hurting them. Yes. But they have thousands of ships. We have dozens. The math does not favor us. Lyra nodded slowly. I know. But we are not trying to beat them through numbers. We are trying to break their spirit. An empire built on fear can only survive if its subjects believe it cannot be challenged. Every battle we win, that belief weakens. As if to prove her point, a communication arrived that day from the Kreeth homeworld. The insectoid species had served the Velthari as slaves for over 800 years. Now, inspired by humanity's rebellion, they had risen up. Millions of Kreeth workers had seized control of factories and shipyards. They were asking for human support. Similar messages came from other worlds. The Morvani, the Telux, the Varani. Species that had accepted their fate for generations were suddenly fighting back. The Empire was cracking from within, but victory came with a price. Lyra felt it every day. She stood alone in her quarters one night, looking at a small photograph. It showed a little girl with dark, curly hair, smiling at the camera. Sophia. The picture was the only thing Lyra had left of her old life. She had carried it with her through 7 years of hiding, planning, and fighting. A knock came at her door. It was Captain Chen Wei, one of her most trusted officers. General, we have intercepted Velthari communications. The Emperor himself is speaking. Lyra followed her to the command center. On the main screen, the face of High Emperor Selvith IX appeared. He was ancient even by Velthari standards, with skin like dried leather and eyes that had seen the conquest of 100 worlds. Citizens of the Empire, he said, his voice cold and arrogant. You have heard rumors of human attacks. These rumors are exaggerated. The humans are a dying species, lashing out in their final moments. They are insects biting at the feet of giants. They will be crushed. The Empire is eternal. The Empire is unstoppable. There is nothing to fear. Lyra watched the message in silence. When it ended, she turned to her officers. He is afraid, she said. Kofi raised an eyebrow. He did not sound afraid to me. That is exactly why I know he is. An emperor who truly believed his own power would not need to make such a speech. He would not need to reassure his people. The fact that he spoke at all means we are hurting them more than we know. She looked at the star map on the wall. At the center of the Velthari Empire, a single world glowed bright. Velthar Prime. The throne world, the heart of everything. We have been fighting the edges, Lyra said. Freeing colonies, destroying outposts. But we will never win this war by nibbling at their borders. We need to strike at the heart. Velthar Prime? Kofi asked. That is madness. They have 1,000 ships defending that world. Then we will need more than 1,000 ships. Lyra turned to face her officers. Contact our allies, the Kreeth, the Morvani, everyone who has joined our cause. Tell them the time for small battles is over. We are going to end this war. One way or another. The message went out across liberated space, and the response was overwhelming. Ships began to gather. Human vessels, Kreeth warships built in stolen factories, Morvani crystal cruisers, vessels from a dozen species, all united by one thing: hatred of the Velthari Empire, and hope for a better future. The largest fleet in galactic history was forming. And it had one target. General Lyra Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Times, Remembrance Times, and watched the armada take shape around her. Thousands of ships, millions of soldiers, all waiting for her command. She thought of Sophia, of Marco, of the 2 billion who had died in fire. We are coming, she whispered to the stars. And nothing in this universe will stop us. The coalition fleet jumped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Velthar system. 3,000 ships, 12 million soldiers, the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the galaxy. General Lyra Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Times Remembrance Asterisk, looking at the tactical display. Ahead of them, Velthar Prime hung in space like a jewel. It was a beautiful world, covered in shining cities and green forests. It had never known war. It had never felt the fire that it had brought to so many other worlds. That was about to change. Report, Lyra said. Admiral Kofi Asante studied the sensor data. The Velthari defense fleet is mobilizing. Approximately 2,000 ships, mostly battlecruisers and carriers. They are forming a defensive line between us and the planet. 2,000 against 3,000, Captain Chenwei said. The odds are in our favor. Do not get confident. Lyra warned. Those are their elite ships, crewed by their best soldiers. They will fight harder than anything we have faced before. They are defending their home. She turned to the communications officer. Open a channel to all coalition forces. The officer nodded. Channel open, General. Lyra's face appeared on screens across the entire fleet. Humans, Kreth, Morvani, and a dozen other species watched and listened. Warriors of the coalition, she began. 10 years ago, the Velthari Empire decided to wipe humanity from existence. They burned our cities. They murdered our families. They thought we would simply die and be forgotten. Her voice grew stronger. They were wrong. Not only did we survive, but we found brothers and sisters across the stars. Species who had suffered just as we suffered. Peoples who had been crushed, enslaved, and told they were worthless. Today, we stand together. Today, we fight together. Today, we end the tyranny of the Velthari Empire, forever. She raised her fist. For Earth. For every world they destroyed. For every life they stole. Attack! The coalition fleet surged forward. The Battle of Velthar Prime was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Thousands of ships clashed in the darkness of space, filling the void with fire and light. Energy beams cut through metal. Missiles exploded against shields. Ships rammed into each other and broke apart in clouds of debris. The Velthari fought with desperate fury. They knew what defeat meant. They knew that their empire, their way of life, everything they had built over thousands of years was at stake. They threw everything they had into the battle. But the coalition had something the Velthari did not understand. Unity born from shared suffering. The Kreth pilots flew their ships into suicide attacks without hesitation. The Morvani cruisers formed living shields to protect human carriers. Species that had never met before today fought side by side as if they had trained together for years. And at the center of it all was the Time's Remembrance asterisk, cutting through the enemy fleet like a knife. Enemy flagship detected, Kofi reported. The Time's Divine Throne asterisk. High Emperor Selveth 9 is aboard. Enemy flagship detected. Enemy flagship detected. High Emperor Selveth 9 is aboard. Lyra looked at the tactical display. The Velthari flagship was massive. Nearly 10 times the size of the Time's Remembrance asterisk. It was surrounded by 100 escort ships. Getting to it would be almost impossible. All ships, focus fire on those escorts, Lyra ordered. Clear a path to the flagship. The battle raged for hours. Ships fell on both sides. Heroes died without anyone knowing their names. The space around Velthar Prime became a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen bodies. Slowly, painfully, the coalition pushed forward. Captain Chenwei was killed when her ship was destroyed by enemy fire. Admiral Kofi Asante took a piece of shrapnel to the chest but refused to leave the bridge. Lyra herself was thrown across the command center when a missile hit the Time's Remembrance asterisk, but she climbed back to her feet and kept fighting. Finally, as the battle entered its 8th hour, the Velthari defense line collapsed. Their ships began to retreat toward the planet. The Time's Divine Throne Time stood alone, its escorts destroyed, its shields failing. Enemy flagship is hailing us, the communications officer said. Put it on screen. The face of High Emperor Selveth 9 appeared. He looked old, tired, afraid. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something Lyra had never expected to see in a Velthari. Desperation. General Vasquez, he said. I offer terms of surrender. Lyra said nothing. She just watched him. The attack on Earth was a mistake, the Emperor continued. It was ordered by admirals who acted without my full knowledge. They have been punished. I offer you reparations. Territory. recognition of humanity as an equal species. Whatever you want, just stop this attack. Lyra thought about his words. Peace. An end to the killing. An end to the war that had consumed her life for 10 years. She could accept his offer, and the fighting would stop today. But then she thought about Buenos Aires. About the 2 billion who had died without warning. About Sophia, eating breakfast when the sky turned orange. You speak of mistakes, Lyra said softly. You speak of misunderstandings. As if the genocide of a species was simply a paperwork error. She stepped closer to the screen. Let me tell you what I remember. I remember watching my city burn. I remember searching through ashes for my daughter's body and finding nothing. I remember holding the hands of dying soldiers and promising them their sacrifice would mean something. Her voice hardened. You do not get to call it a mistake. You do not get to buy your way out with money and territory. You came to Earth to kill every single one of us. You almost succeeded. And now you want to negotiate? The Emperor's eyes widened. General, please, we can find a solution. We can. I am not finished, Lyra interrupted. I have spent 10 years dreaming of this moment. 10 years carrying the weight of 2 billion dead. 10 years watching my soldiers die to bring us here. And you want me to accept your apology? She took a deep breath. No. You will surrender unconditionally. Your empire will be dissolved. Your military leaders will face trial for crimes against sentient life. And your people will learn the truth about what you did, so that no one ever forgets. And if I refuse? Lyra's face was cold as stone. Then we continue this battle until there is nothing left to surrender. The Emperor stared at her for a long moment. He saw no mercy in her eyes. No room for negotiation. Just the cold, hard determination of a woman who had lost everything and built herself into a weapon. You are a monster, he said quietly. No, Lyra replied. I am what you created. The Emperor lowered his head. I accept your terms. Lyra nodded. Smart choice. She turned to Kofi, who was still pressing a bandage to his wound. Admiral, secure the enemy flagship. The war is over. Kofi smiled weakly. Is it really? Lyra looked out at Velthar Prime. At the cities that had never known suffering. At the world that had brought so much pain to so many. The fighting is over, she said. Now comes the harder part. The Velthari Empire fell in silence. There were no great celebrations on Velthar Prime. No parades or dancing in the streets. The Velthari people watched in stunned disbelief as coalition soldiers marched through their cities. For thousands of years, they had been told they were the greatest species in the galaxy. They had been told their empire was eternal, unbreakable, destined to rule forever. Now foreign ships filled their sky, and their emperor knelt in chains. General Lyra Vasquez walked through the imperial palace, surrounded by guards from a dozen different species. The building was beautiful beyond words, filled with treasures stolen from conquered worlds. Paintings from the Morvani, sculptures from the Kreth, artifacts from species that no longer existed because the Velthari had wiped them out. She stopped in front of a large map on the wall. It showed the empire at its greatest extent. Over 2,000 worlds, stretching across half the galaxy. Each conquered planet was marked with the date of its pacification. Earth was there too, a small blue dot on the edge of the map, marked as pacified 13 years ago. Lyra reached out and touched the dot. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she turned and walked away. The trials began 3 months later. A special court was created, made up of judges from every species in the coalition. They heard testimony from survivors of Velthari atrocities. They watched recordings of orbital bombardments and mass executions. They listened as former slaves described generations of suffering. One by one, the architects of genocide faced justice. Admiral Zethos, who had personally ordered the attack on Earth. Governor Velmac, who had overseen the extermination of the Telek species. General Korthax, who had designed the pacification protocols used against hundreds of worlds. Each was found guilty. Each was sentenced to life imprisonment on a distant asteroid, far from the stars they had once ruled. High Emperor Selveth IX was the last to face trial. He sat in the courtroom, looking smaller and weaker than he had on his throne. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty of crimes against sentient life on a scale never before recorded. "Do you have anything to say?" the chief judge asked. The old emperor looked up at the court. "I did what I believed was right for my people. I built an empire that brought order to the chaos of the galaxy. History will judge me differently than you do." Lyra stood in the audience, watching. She felt nothing. No satisfaction. No joy. Just a cold emptiness that had lived inside her for 13 years. The emperor was sentenced to spend the rest of his life watching recordings of the atrocities committed in his name, every day, every hour, until he understood what he had done. Some said it was cruel. Others said it was not cruel enough. Lyra did not care what others said. The Galactic Coalition was officially formed 6 months after the fall of the Empire. 23 species signed the founding charter, promising to protect each other, to share resources, and to never allow another empire to rise through conquest and genocide. Humanity was given a seat on the Coalition Council, equal to species that had traveled the stars for thousands of years. Some aliens still looked at humans with suspicion or fear. They remembered the ruthlessness of the human war machine, the cold efficiency with which Lyra Vasquez had dismantled an empire. But most looked at humans with something else. Respect. "They were dying," a Kreth ambassador said during a council meeting. "Their world was burned. Their people were scattered. Any other species would have given up, but humans never stopped fighting, never stopped believing they could win. That is why they sit at this table today. Not because of their technology or their resources, but because of their spirit." Lyra did not attend that meeting. She had retired from military service 1 year after the war ended. She had given everything she had to the fight. There was nothing left to give. She returned to Earth. The planet was healing slowly. Cities were being rebuilt. Children were being born who had never known the burning sky. Life was returning to a world that had almost died, but the scars remained. They would remain forever. Lyra visited Buenos Aires on a spring morning, 20 years after the attack. The city was different now. New buildings stood where old ones had fallen. New streets ran through places that had once been craters. A new generation was growing up, knowing the war only from history books. At the center of the city was a memorial. A wall of black stone, stretching for kilometers in every direction. On it were carved 2 billion names. Every human who had died in the attack, every life that had been lost when the fire fell from the sky. Lyra walked along the wall slowly, reading the names. So many names. So many stories that would never be told. So many futures that would never happen. She found what she was looking for near the center of the wall. Sofia Vasquez, age 7. Marco Vasquez, age 44. Her daughter, her husband. 2 names among billions. But to Lyra, they were everything. She reached out and touched the carved letters. They were cold beneath her fingers. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "I made them pay for what they did. I made sure the galaxy would never forget." Tears ran down her cheeks. After 20 years, she finally allowed herself to cry. "I do not know if you would be proud of me. I do not know if I became a hero or a monster. Maybe both. Maybe neither." She pressed her forehead against the stone. "I just know that I never stopped loving you. And I never stopped fighting for you. Every day, every battle, it was always for you." She stayed there for a long time, alone with her memories. When she finally turned to leave, she saw a young girl standing nearby. The child had dark, curly hair and curious eyes. She was maybe 7 years old. "Are you the Gray General?" the girl asked. "My mama told me about you. She said you saved Earth." Lyra knelt down to look the child in the eyes. For a moment, she saw Sophia. Just for a moment. "I did not save Earth alone," she said softly. "Many people fought. Many people died. I just made sure their sacrifice meant something. My mama says you are a hero." Lyra smiled sadly. I am just a woman who lost everything and refused to give up. That does not make me a hero. It just makes me human. She stood up and looked one last time at the memorial wall. 2 billion names. 2 billion reasons why she had fought. Remember them, she told the girl. Remember what happened here. And make sure it never happens again. She walked away, leaving the past behind. The galaxy was at peace. The war was over. Humanity had risen from the ashes and taken its place among the stars. But Lyra Vasquez knew the truth. Peace was fragile. Empires could rise again. New threats would come. When that day arrived, humanity would be ready. They had been forged in fire. They had survived the impossible. And they would never, ever forget. That was the human way.